If they were to set up a joint Facebook page, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and US President Barack Obama's relationship status would read, "It's complicated." With personal and policy differences airing publicly in the press, there's no denying the two governments have a complex personal and strategic relationship, and that it's often at odds with itself. Now, with nuclear talks continuing with Iran and Israel potentially facing a key vote in the United Nations, the United States must decide how far it will go to support its historic ally. Joining us here in Washington is Boaz Bismuth. He served as Israel's ambassador to Mauritania under Prime Ministers Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert. And with us from Princeton, New Jersey, is the former U.S. ambassador to Israel during President George W. Bush's first term in office, Daniel Kurtzer. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. Ambassador Kurtzer, right now, does the United States have anything like a roadmap, a plan, a blueprint to resolve this conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
I think the Obama administration is actually in the midst of developing its strategy in the period ahead. Until now, the administration had looked at John Kerry's ideas and thought that they would be seized by the two parties. This was the idea of getting to negotiations on the basis of agreed terms of reference, some confidence-building measures each side would take, some outside assistance through the Arab states and economic aid, and that didn't work. And so the administration now, I think, is searching for its next steps, whether they come through initiatives of the parties or whether they're brought before the United Nations Security Council. I don't think there's any certainty yet as to what the administration will decide to do.
Ambassador Bismuth, while the Obama administration tries to formulate its policy towards Israel, what is the Israeli plan?
So first of all, I must agree with Ambassador Kurtzer. The confidence building was a very important issue, of course. I mean, and unfortunately, when you see in the area what's happening right now, you've seen that we have gone backwards. Of course, I mean, the aim of resolving the problem in 9 months, as John Kerry's plan was, or Obama's administration was, and failing in that, on the contrary, it took us backwards, and you'll see a lot of frustration in the region. Now, concerning Israel, the plan. So let's first of all remember that in Israel right now, it's election time. Election time is not always a very good time in order to accelerate a peace process or anything. On the contrary, I think that we are losing 3 important months. At the same time, the other part, of course, the Palestinians are not waiting for Israel to vote a new government or the old one again. On the contrary, they're moving on. So are you suggesting that everything should be put on hold while we wait for the election to take place? First of all, I mean, I would say that if Americans will put a veto again on the Palestinian proposition, that won't be something new. On the contrary, if there will not be an American veto for me, and Ambassador Kurtzer will remember that perfectly from historical time, that will be an American interference in Israeli elections, of course. Ambassador Kurtzer, you do not suppose...
I don't agree at all that American support for UN resolution would be an interference in Israeli election affairs. You know, life doesn't stand still for anybody's elections, and the United States has its own views, its own policies, and its own interests. And I think if a reasonable resolution is put forward, not one that's punitive and not one that changes the basic framework of peace, I think the United States ought to look at it very carefully. And should the United States either vote in favor or abstain, rather than see this as an interference in Israeli election, maybe the Israelis will start debating whether or not they should be revising their own views about peace.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador? No, I would say, first of all, I mean, for me, let's not forget, and Ambassador Kurtzer remembers, I mean, the history of vetoes, of American vetoes, which reminds us again how much America is the biggest ally Israel has ever had. And even this summer, when we had this, again, another war in Gaza, we have seen how much Israel had the importance of American support for Israel, for Israel's defense. So, of course, this is clear. Yet at the same time, in parallel, we have a war with Hamas, of course, on the ground. Yet we have also with, unfortunately, Abu Mazen, or Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, a diplomatic battle. Now, we shouldn't. I mean, he should be our ally. We shouldn't have any confrontation with the Palestinian Authority. And that is why I would expect him not to go on unilateral actions or unilateral steps as they're doing right now. On the contrary, I think that any unilateral step we have seen ever since in the Middle East, on the contrary, did not contribute to peace. peace. And by the way, when I say unilateral, not only Palestinians, don't forget 2005, during Sharon time, I was ambassador in Mauritania at the time, the disengagement from the Gaza Strip was an Israeli unilateral act, and I don't think that that really solved any problem.
Right, Ambassador Kurtz, there are two proposals for the UN Security Council to consider right now. One, which is from the Palestinians, which is that Israel withdraw to the 67 borders. The other, which has been proposed by France, is that negotiations take place with two states being created in 2 years' time. And under that resolution, it does not call upon the Palestinians to recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish state, etc., which is not acceptable to Israel. So do any of those two resolutions have a chance of being passed by the UN?
Well, it's hard to comment on resolutions whose exact language we haven't seen. After all, the devil is going to be in the details. From what we understand of the Palestinian resolution, it will probably cross not only Israeli red lines, but also American red lines with respect to the unilateral demands for recognition. The question is going to be, however, whether the European draft, which is being led by the French now, will find some formula drawing from traditional American policy and also what John Kerry has tried to accomplish that may in fact attract American support. So it's, I wouldn't draw any judgments before we've seen the language. And I think part of what Prime Minister Netanyahu and Secretary of State Kerry talked about just the other day in Rome was the conditions under which the United States might actually find it necessary or reasonable to support a resolution if the language is properly constructed.
Well, Ambassador Bismuth, let me throw one other spanner in the works right now, and that is, in just a few weeks, the U.S. Congress will be ruled totally by the Republican Party. They will have control of both houses, and we know that there is unconditional, unswerving support for Israel in both houses. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can simply sit this out, and he knows he has support in Congress. He can bypass the White House.
Now, first of all, I enjoyed a lot hearing about the languages. I don't think that the French language is always supposed to be anti-Israeli, because in Israel, I must admit, very much worried about from this French draft, especially the time, the 2 years given, and after 2 years recognizing the Palestinian state, whatever happens in those 2 years. Now, concerning what you said concerning the Hill and the change, of course, of majority, let's not forget that relationship are between governments and between, of course, the Israeli government and the American administration. The White House is very important. I mean, in foreign affairs, one mustn't forget that. Let's not forget again that maybe from time to time you do see disagreement, of course, and it's a known thing. I mean, that's not a secret anymore, disagreement between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Yet at the same time, in rainy days, I mean, Israel did find, how would I say, the White House was here for Israel, as I said before, like this summer again. The change in the Hill maybe can provoke, of course, more support for Israel. I mean, we know that in America, and Ambassador Kurtz knows it better than I, that of course, I mean, in the Senate, of course, in the Congress, of course, in public opinion, Israel has its support. Also, I think in the White House, you can't say that everyone does not support. Again, you can be French, you can be Israeli, you can be right-wing, you can be left-wing, you can be Republican or Democrat. What are we seeking for? We're seeking for peace. We're seeking to settle this Palestinian-Israeli conflict that really takes, I mean, for decades already is here, and is also tiring public opinion in the world, and does not also contribute, of course, for peace. It doesn't mean that when you will solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, all the world will be peaceful all over. I mean, this is totally, this is a legend that it's about time to put an end to it. Yet at the same time, and I would like to interfere to the words that were said right now, if the problem was territorial, I think we would have solved it many, many years ago. Unfortunately, it's much deeper than that, and you mentioned in your question that it was very correct to say Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2009 recognized the fact of the importance of having two states for two nations, for two peoples. We still wait the moderate in the Palestinian side still to agree or to accept the idea of a Jewish state, and that I haven't seen yet in the French draft.
Ambassador Kurtz, there is another issue, and that is the personal relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. An Israeli columnist, Ari Shavit, described that relationship as based on mutual loathing. To what extent does that hamper the whole process?
Well, it's certainly been a problem over these past 6 years, and will likely remain a problem should Prime Minister Netanyahu return to office. I think the Prime Minister would be ill-advised to think that with a supportive Congress, he can ignore the administration. That is not wise policy, and presidents have a tremendous amount of power, even when it comes to relations with Israel. We have examples in the past, President George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, where in U.S.-Israeli disputes, the administration would normally win out over the Congress. So I think if one were to whisper in the Prime Minister's ear, I wouldn't be too sanguine about the possibility of ignoring the president. I think Ari Shavit has characterized the relationship pretty accurately, although the words are tough. The two men don't trust each other. They clearly don't like each other, and that's been a problem in dealing with very sensitive issues at the top. That said, the basic structure of the U.S.-Israeli relationship remains quite strong. And in fact, in the past 6 years of the Obama administration, the quantitative improvements in U.S.-Israeli relations have been enormous. It's now a better relationship than ever in the past, which tells you that there's an enduring nature of the ties between the two countries.
Right, Ambassador Bismuth, in addition to Ari Shavit calling that relationship based on mutual loathing, we've also heard other very pejorative comments in these two leaders describing themselves. We remember that infamous Atlantic article,
yes,
in which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was referred to chicken excrement, if I could put it that way. It was a bit harsh. We've also heard Netanyahu being described as recalcitrant, myopic, reactionary, obtuse, aspergery, whatever that is. And then we had Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon calling the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry messianic and obsessive. How did it get to this stage?
Well, let me say one thing, and I think that your guest also, Ambassador Kurtz, will agree with you. Relationship between countries, I mean, it's not like a couple that is dating, going to the restaurant or having dinner or watching the movie. It's interests.
But these are friends.
And that's what I was going to say. And this is not only interest, this is great allies, great friends. And I mean, if you walk with me now in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Ramle or any street in Israel, you will see the support, that every Israeli has for America, and the American flag, really touches every Israeli. And I think Ambassador Kurtz knows exactly what I'm talking about. How much, you would see Israelis, being influenced by anything that is American, American culture, American music, American food, any American issue. Now, it is true also, and we must agree, that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama do not share the same vision of life. They don't share the same ideology. Some people, even in Israel, say that on the contrary, if Republicans are looking for a candidate, Netanyahu could be a great candidate in the elections, which is, in a way, it's true. They are very, one is very conservative, the other one, on the contrary, is very liberal. One is, as I would say, President Obama, to whom, of course, is the American president, and of course we should pay respect, is someone with a much more wishful thinking, whereas Netanyahu is much more cautious. You should hear both of them and see the way their speeches and see the difference. Yet at the same time, those 6 years that Obama's administration has proven that, on the contrary, as it was said right now, relations did not deteriorate. On the contrary, cooperation was only strengthened. So I think that, as was said beautifully right now, of course, Israeli government shouldn't think that the Capitol Hill is enough. That's not enough, of course. President have a great importance. And at the same time, I think, let's not forget that Netanyahu and Obama, they're right now in post right now for at least one for 2 years, and the other one for at least 3 months. They have to work together. Now, what will happen after Israeli elections? I tend to believe that, as Secretary of State Kerry said here in Washington last week, America won't interfere in the elections, and if it happens that Netanyahu will continue to be Prime Minister, they will find a way to work together, although all those harsh words that were said.
Ambassador Kurtz, do you share that optimism? Because there are other things moving on the ground as well. We've just heard that there's been a declaration adopted by about 120 of the 200 signatories to the 4th Geneva Convention, which says Israel's settlement construction in the West Bank and East Jerusalem violates its responsibilities as an occupying power. That's one. We had a European Union court which says that the group Hamas will no longer be on a list of terrorist organizations. So there are things moving outside of the bilateral relationship between Israel and the United States.
Well, I would like to be optimistic, but I don't think I share Ambassador Bismuth's optimism in this particular instance. There are the changes that you noted in Europe. There are also changes in the United States. There's a growing movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which so far has not become very widespread, but it's appearing on a variety of university campuses. We've now seen it in California in one trade union. There's a certain amount of disenfranchisement of even parts of the American Jewish community that just doesn't understand why Israel continues to build settlements and continues to exert pressure on the Palestinians under occupation. So there are some very worrying signs on the horizon, and I think that the Israeli electorate, as it goes to the voting booth, has to be thinking not only about its pocketbook. I mean, elections normally are based upon economic and social issues, but also about Israel's standing in the world. Does Israel want to maintain this kind of adamant front, declaring everyone to be an enemy if they oppose Israeli policies, as opposed to thinking about whether or not its friends can be helpful in mitigating some of the risks that Israel might have to take for peace? The United States for 30, 40 years now has been as close as it has been to Israel, in part because it wants to help Israel take the risks necessary for peace. If Israel's not ready to do that, though, then at some point, American policymakers are going to throw up their hands and say, there's not much more we can do to help, and that's not going to be a healthy moment in the relationship or in Israel's relations with its Arab neighbors.
I'm afraid I'll give you 10 seconds.
Just 10 seconds, only to say that when I was optimistic, it's concerning, I mean, the work between American administration and Jerusalem, of course. But concerning what is happening right now in the world, the fact that Israel, for example, what you said right now, what you mentioned about Hamas being all of a sudden, I mean, not having the stain of being a terrorist group, I mean, for what reason does this change? I mean, did they become, I mean, did they join the Philharmonic of Boston or Chicago? So let's be honest, I mean, the world is changing. Israel, I mean, is not the cause for the unrest in the region. I think that America will continue to be on their side, because I think that, on the contrary, for the United States, I mean, the country that coincides with American values in the region is still Israel.
Ambassador Boaz Bismuth, Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, thanks to both of you for joining us.